big magnitude what people's health was like, and if certain things in certain communities would be detrimental. So my little pipsqueak of a work wouldn't measure up at all to the magnification of those who really did this to put census together. It really is a census factor also to put that together, and in their questionnaire they ask all these questions and more than I do.
In regards to the history of Evansville and civilization in Evansville, we see the walks of people. The walks of people are their hobbies, their church, and their occupation. Can you amplify how you've listed all churches, all hobbies, and all occupations on your cards?
In listing all churches and hobbies and employment on my card, it's sort of a plate of graphic information showing the membership of the church. I always thought that was important to a family growing up. I didn't show all their schooling or their grade school or their collegiate work, but that would be an interesting study too. I have some of it in there, but not in a vast amount. And then hobbies some way or another reflect a man's walking through life, because they may take on a certain hobby, and that may become strenuous, or that it may become contribute to their adaptability in things. And so each of those little things that a man does, if he does it in vast numbers of years or vast amount of time in pursuing a hobby or a second occupation or something, all that has to do with how a man makes this walk through life.
As a person observing history, many historians or genealogists will look at your cards. What value do you think they would have of your cards?
Well, one of the great values of my cards is genealogy, where you could build a family up or down, taking how far back you go in your medium of research. If you go back far enough, you show the grandparents or the great-grandparents, and before too many years go by, here comes another level of this family, and so many more years go by, another level of the family. So it is a great medium to build, can we say, a family tree from step to step. But I don't get it all, but I get what appears in the paper. Now, everything doesn't have appear in the paper. That depends upon the reporter or what the newspaper decides to collect and make as a part of their entries.
So as a historian walks through this world and they look at your cards, how do your cards help them find out more about the people of Evansville, about the genealogy of people in Evansville, and how easy is it for them to find information from your cards? Why are your cards easier to find information than me going to the newspaper itself?
Well, the biggest step that I think that I made in my composing all this together is switching from chronology to alphabetical. Now, a person who is researching a man named George Jones or Harry Smith or Pete Brown, they don't go to a date of like the date of in January of 2006. They get this man Jones or Brown or Smith, and they go to his name. Now, going to his name is where I put these entries, whether they be big or small or meaningful to some people or not. It still has in my entries who they are. Most of my entries now are obituary cards, even though I have as big a collection of other cards as I have obituary cards. But the obituary card shows their age at that time. So you can, if a person were to die in 1990, the card treats to their lifetime, which would have probably been from 1920 to 1990, which ends up the average, close to the average of people's life, a 70-year period. And during that time, I wouldn't have all their contributions logged into that entry, but I usually have the main thing. If they worked in the factory in Evansville, that main thing would be on. If they went to a big church in Evansville, that would be on there. And then, of course, comes down with the main thrust, the family. And If they had 3 children, they would be listed. If they had 4 or 5 siblings, they would be listed. So the research of mine is still people.
Your source of information, as you just said, is the newspaper. It depends on the accuracy of the newspaper. It depends on how many things the newspaper lists. Are there very many people in Evansville that die that the newspaper does not have an entry on their death?
By the thousands. But that's why I did this work on the newspapers recording the people in the instances as they came through. Now, of course, the newspaper is made up of violence and other misdeeds of people. So in all my research, I have never logged or never entered into my work murders or robberies or misconduct. I only go through the paper and pull things that are contributory to the excess of this method of life. And so I haven't pursued that element of people in my work, even though that is findable in the newspaper. But what I pull out of the newspaper are the credits that a person receives. Like if a person worked at the bank and is promoted by a level or 2, then that's a credit to he and his family. So I try to get those into my studies. People works at the big factories and there was promotions and retirement. Each of those things belong. Retirement shows that they've come to the end of their working days, and then they too oftentimes appear in the paper as being preparing to retire. So those are the things that I amassed together in my study.
The newspapers in general will log every person that has died in the Evansville area. You do not miss any obituaries in the last 100 years of what's been logged in the Evansville newspaper. How many does the Evansville newspaper miss? Because if the Evansville newspaper misses an obituary, then you miss it in your cards. How often does that occur?
Well, in my research and in my study on that, in the thousands of funerals that I've had over the past 50 years, 50 plus years, I've only had maybe, now this is a vast study now, I've only had maybe 1 or 2 or 3 families in all that period of time to say, I don't want this put in the newspaper. And if that be true of me, that also can be parallel to other funeral homes. So they don't all get there, but boy, they get out there to the 99% deal, and even 99 point percentage. And people ask that, and the newspaper is ready to get it. In the early days of the newspaper, in the early days of telephone, that was the only way they could get it, and sometimes they would miss them back in the early part of this past century because people didn't have the mode to get there. In the early days, they took this piece of paper manually to the newspaper. But as the telephone took charge of transferring information, it became the main source. And even in my early career, the newspaper called me twice a day for 20, 30, 40 years. And before me, other funerals, when the telephone was in vogue, had come into vogue, the telephone would call all funeral homes 2 or 3 or 4 times a day. That's like making a news beat. They're going to get where the news might be. They could walk downtown and try to find news if they want to, but this is what they did for one facet. They had 2 or 3 desks in every newspaper office to take care of this 2 or 3 columns, as well as the social page and the sports page, which became a great thing for long years, but in the last year or 2, the sports page in the Evansville paper is showing up many times with only two double-faced pages, which is a total of 4. I never did see it so small in all my observing of the newspaper as far as the sports page is concerned. But obituary column has remained constant and is received by the paper and seeked out by the paper people to the different places. And their first line of finding out that is at the funeral home.
You have relied on your information on the newspapers. How accurate do you think the newspapers are in the reporting the obituaries of individuals that have died in Evansville?
I give them a high percentage on that. They do well. In fact, as in my early days of study, there was the Courier and the Press both, so I could easily check them out, one against the other, and they too would check themselves out against the other, but they wouldn't call the other paper for the news. They'd call the families and be in touch with the families or the funeral home. So their expertise on that became very high in percentage of correctness, and they did the best they could, because accuracy is their keen point too, and they don't want flaws in their contribution. Now, we're talking about newspaper here pretty much, but I forgot to throw into this study the fact that I have thousands of entries in there from a thing called yearbooks, and that is people, but no great contribution of what they've done, except they've arrived at that milestone of their life.
In regards to the newspapers, you searched the newspapers from 1906 to the year 2006 and recorded all obituary notices in that period of time. So you have a century of information of obituaries. Is it a mimeographed copy or a Xerox copy of the newspaper, or do you distill the information from the newspaper? And why do you distill the information from the newspaper?
In distilling my information from the newspaper, my main forte has been obituaries and people. And that's been what I have pursued from the paper. And I have done that mostly from the paper itself, at least in the last 50 years of the century, of the past century. But in the first 50 years of the past century, it was by Xerox. And what I did for a number of years is go backwards in the newspaper from 1950 or 45, wherever my starting point was, go backwards and backwards and backwards, and I photostated from the paper the obituary columns. And I didn't do the other part of the paper like the sporting page or the society news. But as I chased the paper to find the obituary page, oftentimes I found something of a person that was noteworthy, and I might have photostated that, made a clipping of that, which sort of filled up my people study work through the years, but never as efficient or as powerful as it is today. I comb the paper from page to page, but I don't take big write-ups. I just take little vignettes and little contributions to a person and what the person did. So my work is not a total newspaper. They're much better at that than I am, but that's a chronological entry. Mine is alphabetical.
As I look at the obituary column in the Evansville newspapers, has many things listed about a person, their accomplishments, and their family. You, in the 1950s, divided all those accomplishments, all those pieces of information, such as the name, the date of death, the age of death, the cemetery, the funeral home, possibly the address, the ancestors, their employment, their hobbies. All those were kept in a separate category, a separate field of information, just as we would in the computers of the 1990s and 2000s. How did you arrive at these different fields of information that were frequently seen events in the obituary column? How did you arrive at that conclusion in the 1950s to separate them into different categories?
When I created this study, for the first year or two or three, I battled back and forth with this idea, and I got it isolated down to the format that I have that picks up maybe 10, 12, or 15 item lines on this card study, and it could be put into a computer machine so that if you wanted to know everybody that worked at Whirlpool, all the names could appear. Now you got to remember that these are all the names of people who have died into my study like that. And so that